This presentation is brought to you by theKathleenWellsShow.com.
Coming up, my interview about fracking with a toxicologist, a geologist, and an activist. Hi, this is Kathleen with the Progressive Voices Network. Dr. James Dahlgren is a toxicologist who has studied and treated thousands of victims of toxic chemical poisoning, including the subjects dramatized in the Aaron Brockovich movie. Currently, Dr. Dahlgren has been evaluating data from people near the Baldwin Hills oil field. Baldwin Hills, it's located in south central Los Angeles. That's where I live. Dr. Tom Williams is a geologist. He has traveled the globe. His important oil and gas experiences includes working for the U.S. Corps of Engineers, L.A. Midland. He's also worked in the Philippines and in Dubai. And an activist, Paul Ferrazi. He's the executive director of the Coalition for Safe Communities. Take a listen. This interview originally aired on KCAA AM 1050 NBC News Talk Radio. Welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host. Normally, regular listeners to my program know that I've been spending a lot of time on the Middle East because it's like a hotbed of violence, a hotbed of bad things are coming out of the Middle East. And also, I aired 28 episodes of Palestine Today, so I've always been focused on Israel and Palestine. But today, and you know what, a few days ago, what was it, Monday, we launched, the U.S., when I say we, I'm talking about the United States, launched airstrikes on Syria. So you know I want to talk about that, but instead of going, and I will discuss it, but today I'm going to focus on the domestic issues, the domestic issues that are a hotbed. And one of the domestic issues that are a hotbed in the United States is the issue of fracking. In fact, it wasn't the other day, it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. You know, I do my regular walk in Baldwin Hills. For those who aren't listening in Los Angeles, Baldwin Hills is in Los Angeles. For those listening outside of Los Angeles, Baldwin Hills is in Los Angeles. The KCAA is in the Inland Empire. I do my regular walk in Baldwin Hills because I live around there. And there was a young man there, Gary Geese. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's the president of the Citizens Coalition for Safe Communities. I knew they were fracking in that area. I knew they were fracking in Baldwin Hills. And I knew I wanted to talk about it. But meeting Gary prompted me to talk about it sooner rather than later. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about fracking. We're going to get informed about fracking. I have three guests who are informed about the issue, who are experts about the issue. So let me get straight to my first guest. It's Dr. Tom Williams. Let me tell you a little bit about him before I bring him on. Why are you laughing, Mia? Oh, is that him? Is that you laughing?
Yeah, the doctor laughing.
Is that you laughing, Dr. Williams?
Yes.
Why were you laughing?
A few words.
Okay, well, let me tell you a few things about Dr. Williams before I bring him on. And you know I'm partial to you because you received your PhD, your education from Berkeley. That's my alma mater, believe it or not. So,
67 through 76.
And that's fantastic.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, you know, I think that's fantastic. Anyone who brings information, who studied at Berkeley, I'm partial to, I'm biased with. So I believe you before you even start speaking. Do you know what I mean? I think Berkeley is a very reputable institution, and people are very educated. And I was educated at that school, so you know everyone knows that I know what's going on. If I don't know what's going on, I bring people on who know what's going on. Right, Dr. Williams?
Yep.
Okay, well, you received your PhD in geology and zoology, and you've been all over the world. You've worked with various organizations, the U.S. Corps of Engineers. You've worked for Chevron, Morro Bay. You've worked in Elk Hills Naval Strategic Reserves. You've also worked for L.A. Midland, Odessa, ARCO, Parson Corps. I mean, on and on and on. You've worked all over the world. You've been in Africa, Asia. So you're going to inform us what fracking is. You know, when you talk to people, a lot of people don't even know what fracking is. So, Dr. Williams, welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show.
Thank you.
Well, inform my listeners, inform them, what is fracking exactly?
Okay, fracking simply is breaking up hard rock to make it fractured. Hydraulic fracturing means you use a liquid or even a gas to break the rock, like you would if you were going to explode a stick of dynamite. But you do it hopefully at a deep enough depth that it doesn't have any problems on the surface. The primary issue right now is that fracking is being widely used throughout the United States and expanding to the world. And in California, we have a few things that other places don't have called faults. And a lot of our communities also depend upon groundwater for their water supplies, both for drinking and for agriculture. So we're quite concerned about what is called hydraulic fracturing, which can also go by the name of just fracking, or acid fracks, or frac packing, or other things. But it's the use of very high pressure liquids, usually with chemicals and sometimes sand, to break open the rock and to prop it open long enough so that the oil and gas that's in the tight geological formation can flow out to the well. So when I say high pressures, I mean pressures that exceed 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 psi. That's a lot of pressure, and at those pressures you could cut steel. It would kill a person to be exposed to just a little hole of 3,000 psi gas or liquid. So we're quite concerned about what happens. Also in California, we're fracking in areas that have already been drilled by old wells. Last night there was a meeting over in Fullerton where there was some discussion, and in fact we have found through CCSC that the earliest fracking that we could find in Southern California was down in the Huntington Beach area in 1960 to 62. They were fracking there. So we're quite concerned about what this will do, not only to the rock itself, but to any other well that is near the fracking site and or faults that might allow the fracking fluid and pressures to escape along the fault plane as oil and gas escapes from beneath the earth in the Rancho La Brea tar pits on Wilshire and many other places. So that's the basic element, breaking the rock with high-pressure water.
Breaking the rock with high-pressure water. And you say, and it's interesting because when you talk to people, not everyone knows what it is. So it's the breaking of the rock with high-pressure water. And in fact, our government over the past 2 decades, in an effort to reduce dependence on imported fossil fuel, has supported increased exploration and production of natural gas. So, and some proponents of fracking argue that it is profitable, that it's the way to go, but people who are against fracking say that the risk outweigh the benefit. Is that the position you come down on?
Yes. Well, it's not only that the risks outweigh the benefits, but it's also a matter of tell the people what you're going to do and be honest with them. I go back to one basic principle, informed consent. But in order to be on the same page as somebody else, I have to have the page that they have. And the oil and gas companies make money based upon, say, restricted information. So we're quite concerned about just being informed as to when it's going to occur, what is going to occur, and what are the effects of it.
And what are the... I'm sorry, go ahead.
And, well, the effects, I can go on with that. You have both the direct effects that fracking pump systems have exploded and have been burned out. That has occurred. Not yet in the state of California. However, in the Bakersfield area, they had a blowout through the soil of a frack job or a steam fracking job, and a person was actually poached to death by falling into the crater that had been formed. So we're quite concerned about, number one, being informed about it, being prepared for it, and knowing what to do if something goes wrong. And that's a serious issue directly. Indirectly, we have the escape of gases and fluids sometimes to the surface, and that allows for the escape of gases, H2S, sulfur gas, and methane and VOCs, or ozone precursors. So there's a lot on the direct risk from it. Then you have the air pollution. We're concerned about water pollution, especially how the water from the fracking job itself and the fracturing process may escape from the deeper formations and, I say, get into the shallower aquifers and groundwater sources.
So, and you said in California that there is you suggested that there is a correlation between earthquakes, because you mentioned fault lines, and this drilling, this fracking.
Well, yeah. Last night there was a presentation over at Cal State Fullerton, and the issue of the faults and earthquakes that La Habra and Brea have had in the recent past, back in March. And the USGS said, oh, there's no direct relation. However, he, might say, scrubbed the information, and he forgot to tell people that there were over 200 earthquakes in the La Habra Heights, Brea, Fullerton area over a matter of about a month. Those were measurable. But they're trying to figure out, what fault those earthquakes were coming from and how it relates to the oil and gas operations in the La Habra Heights, Whittier Hills area, all the way down to Brea, Olinda. So we're quite concerned about the fact that USGS didn't provide all of the information that's available, and might say their basic hypothesis was, well, fracking doesn't do it. Probably other groundwater, other oil water injection doesn't do it either. But we don't know. And there was a lot of issues in the oil and gas discussions where people come out and eventually say, we don't know for sure. So, but the issue does exist. There was fracking in the Brea, La Habra area, and there were unusual numbers of measurable earthquakes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, but it hasn't been that there. We don't know definitively that there's a correlation between fracking and earthquakes. Is that apt?
There have been some studies that were done in England and in British Columbia, where they actually monitored the, I'd say, earthquakes related directly to fracking jobs there, and they found that there were very few earthquakes, but they were measurable earthquakes, and it goes back that, well, nobody felt them. Therefore, there wasn't an earthquake. Well, with the technology that we have these days, and the oil companies use it also, to locate where their fracking is going to go and how it has been breaking the rock. I might say there are technologies that can listen to the rock and hear it pop. Those are very low-level earthquakes, but they are still earthquakes. So, yes, fracking causes earthquakes because you're breaking the earth and producing a measurable, although not necessarily feelable or damaging earthquake. Yeah, One of the issues that we also have is that once you frack it, fracking is forever. Once the formation is broken, the tight formation, rigid formation that was there before is no longer rigid, no longer tight. And when a real earthquake comes along, quotes natural earthquake comes along, the entire ground will respond differently than it would have if no fracking had gone on.
We're going to take a break right now. We're talking with Dr. Tom Williams. He's a zoologist and a geologist. And when we come back from the break, Dr. Williams, I'm going to ask you, what prompted you to take the position that you take against fracking? What prompted you to do that? What were the circumstances that made you realize this is not a good thing to do? We're going to take a break. When we come back from the break, Dr. Williams is going to answer that question. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. We're talking about what? Fracking. I hope you're getting informed about the practice. Listen, they got a fracking hill, they're doing fracking right there in Baldwin Hills. Everyone knows where Baldwin Hills is if you live in Los Angeles, right? That's where I walk. That's where I live. I'm concerned. We're going to talk with Dr. Williams when we come back from the break. We'll be right back. Welcome. You're listening to the Kathleen Wells Show, and we're talking about fracking, and my guest is Dr. Tom Williams. He's an expert in the field. He's an expert zoologist and geologist. So, Dr. Williams, is that you chuckling again?
Yeah.
Well, what I want to ask you, Dr. Williams, is what were the circumstances that made you come to realize that fracking is not a good thing?
Well, my first experience with the oil and gas industry was 60 years ago when I had to work on a rig for 2 months in eastern Kansas and said, this is not the way I want to earn a living. Then, more recently, I've worked on oil and gas projects throughout the world, including the Arctic Ocean. Then a guy named Gary Gless said, hey, could you help me? My building is having problems. So I went over to the Baldwin Hills and looked at his building, and he's sitting on top of an oil field, and the oil field is operating, and the ground is moving up and down. But to find out anything about the oil and gas reservoir under his ground, you have to deal with the oil company and the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, commonly called DOGGR. And the level of secrecy troubled me. I know it from my own direct experience within the oil and gas industry. You never tell anybody anything. And the fiasco that went on in the Gulf of Mexico with British Petroleum, BP, and the huge blowout that they had there had the same issues. So my first issue is always informed consent. Tell your neighbors what you're going to do, and make sure you do it right, and make sure that they know that you're doing it right, and everybody will be happier. If you have a screw-up, be upfront with it, and tell them. Warn them. Make measures, activities that will ensure that you can control what you might cause. If you can't control it, don't do it.
You say informed consent.
Informed consent.
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? Because if the citizenry is informed, if people are informed and they know about the health risks associated with fracking, they're not going to consent to it. So we're going to, we're going to bring on our second guest, and Dr. Williams, you can stay on if you'd like to listen to what he has to say, and also if
I'll be here.
Yeah, if you'd like to interject. My second guest is a doctor also, Dr. Dahlgren, James Dahlgren, who is a board-certified internist and a retired assistant professor from UCLA School of Medicine. That's my undergrad. I mean, isn't that fantastic? I went to UCLA undergrad. He's from UCLA, and then my graduate studies were at Berkeley. So it's perfect. It's almost like I planned it that way, but I swear to you, I didn't. It's just coincidental. But
my wife got her MBA from UCLA.
And see how we're all connected. We're all connected. It's meant to be. So and you're the perfect guest. So Dr. Dahlgren has been in private practice for the past 40 years in internal medicine with a subspecialty in toxicology. So he studied and treated thousands of patients with toxic chemicals. In fact, I know you guys know the movie Erin Brockovich, don't you? I mean, I love that movie. I don't like a lot of movies coming out of Hollywood, but that one, because I'm interested in law and I'm interested in what's happening to people adversely, what's happening to individuals and communities that's adverse. Well, that was an example of that. So he studied some of the subjects from that dramatization, Erin Brockovich. So Dr. Dahlgren, welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show, and tell us some of the health risks associated with fracking.
Well, it's Dr. Dahlgren speaking. I think probably our biggest identified risk to this time is the release of benzene, as well as other VOCs, which enter the air, can get into the water supply if there happen to be nearby water tables or water wells that are used. And throughout the country, that has been the focus of a lot of concern, is the contamination of the water in the vicinity around the oil fields. But I think in terms of the Baldwin Hills case, just as an example, we have two main sources of exposure. One is through the air directly, and one is through what's called soil gas. That is the VOCs, benzene, and many, many other chemicals that are lighter than air leave the underground gas deposits and oil deposits and percolate through the soil and come up to the ground and are daylighted, as it's called, where the volatiles get into the air and are also inhaled by the residents living near oil fields. We have evidence from the Department of Health in Los Angeles that there's an increased rate of leukemia in the Baldwin Hills area. There's also a study from Colorado of people living in an area with a lot of fracking and natural gas wells where there's an increase in leukemia rates. Leukemia is a well-known consequence of exposure to benzene. So I think we could put that at the top of our list of concern. Now, some studies also done in Colorado and in Pennsylvania, and theoretically concerns about the chemicals in oil fields and oil fields that have been fracked in particular are elements that damage the respiratory tract. In fact, a high percentage of people living near oil fields and the recently fracked oil fields complain of respiratory complaints, that is, upper and lower respiratory problems. Serious problems such as asthma are likely to be linked to working and living near an oil field. And the dangers of oil fields are there to start with, but when you add fracking to the process, you greatly increase the release of the VOCs into the air and into the soil. So those are the main concerns that I would express to your audience that we have to worry about. We have enough evidence probably at this point to radically reduce the use of fracking, maybe even ban it altogether, because at the end of the day, we really would be better off using other sources of energy, to be perfectly honest, and by using fracking and reducing the cost of natural gas and oil, we've just encouraged the continued use of that source of energy, which is counterproductive to our society. The EPA has noted that there's a $440 million cost in health effects from fracking. That's their estimate and is probably a very conservative one. But that just indicates to you that they know from their research that releasing these chemicals is causing health effects, and these health effects are impacting our society in a very adverse way.
Mm-hmm. You know, they just recently had a conference in New York about climate change. Is there also a correlation between fracking and climate change?
Absolutely. The release of methane in particular is a big concern that has been expressed by environmentalists and has been seconded by EPA. The U.S. EPA has indicated that about 40% of the methane that is released from industry is coming from oil and gas drilling. And fracking would just increase that. The amount of methane that's released when you frack a well is considerably more than one that has not been fracked. It gets back to this issue of the gases that are being released. Now, EPA has got these various regulations that they're trying to impose to capture that methane, but so far it really hasn't been adequate. There's not enough enforcement. So there's an ongoing issue over the release of methane, which is one of the most important gases that contributes to global warming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so listeners who don't know, the Baldwin Hills area is located in south central Los Angeles. That's where I live, that area. So I could be impacted adversely by...
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us some specifics about your study. I mean,
what we're doing right now is we've been collecting samples, urine samples from people living in the neighborhood and around the Baldwin Hills, within a mile of the oil field. And then we've also collected samples from people that live far away, people who live in the San Fernando Valley, people who live in Santa Monica, people who live in Pasadena, and looking at their urine levels, and we're checking for benzene metabolites. And so far, with our fairly small number of subjects in both the exposed and the controls, we have found a statistically significant higher level of benzene metabolites in the people living in the Baldwin Hills area. Now, that's a cause for great concern because the effect of benzene has now been shown to occur at extremely low levels. Levels in the parts per trillion in the air are adverse to particularly susceptible subpopulations, such as in utero fetuses developing, infants, and certain subclass of the population that have a certain genetic makeup make them more susceptible to benzene. Studies done by the National Cancer Institute in China have shown that there's this population of about 20% of the people who have much greater susceptibility to benzene toxicity. And that's one of the reasons why the acceptable level for benzene exposure has been recommended down far, far lower than it used to be. So we know that if you're exposed to even a few dozen parts per billion, which is the levels that we see around oil fields, particularly oil fields where fracking has taken place, that's sufficient to increase the leukemia risk, which I mentioned earlier we have already seen in the epidemiological studies that have been done.
We're speaking with Dr. James Dahlgren, who is a physician. He worked at he lectured at UCLA School of Medicine. He has treated thousands of patients who have been the victims of toxic chemicals. And he has recently, he studied the folks that were victims of the chemicals being released in the movie. You remember the movie Erin Brockovich? There was a toxic dump there. And you saw many of the victims many of the people being victimized by the toxicity. That's a very difficult word, toxicity. Am I saying it right?
Toxicity is correct. Yes, you got it.
of the chemicals that were being dumped. We're talking with Dr. Dahlgren, and we're going to come back. And when I come back from the break, Dr. Dahlgren, I'm going to ask you, why did they decide to put the drill for oil in Baldwin Hills? I'm going to ask you that question. We'll be right back. Welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host, and we're talking about fracking. We have Dr. Tom Williams, who is a geologist, and he was telling us about the dangers of fracking, why he's against it. Now, we also have Dr. Dahlgren, who is a toxicologist. Is that correct, Dr. Dahlgren? Are you a toxicologist?
Yes, that's what I've been doing for 40 years, is examining and treating patients with exposure to toxic substances.
For 40 years, and currently he's evaluating data from people living near the Baldwin Hills oil field. That's my neck of the woods. So let me ask you, Dr. Dahlgren, why did they decide to place to do drilling in Baldwin Hills, of all places?
Well, I think you have to know the history of Los Angeles to realize that back in the late 19th century, the 1880s and 90s, Los Angeles was the center of oil production in the whole United States. Oil wells were dug by hand, just 20 and 30 and 50 feet below the soil level. And oil would percolate into the hole, and they could use it for various purposes, making waterproof log cabins, for example. But eventually they also would start using it for petroleum in all the many uses we now know for petroleum. And Los Angeles was a heavy oil area. The Baldwin Hills were actually started in the 20s when they found that there was a deposit of oil there. And the houses weren't built then. A lot of the Baldwin Hills was kind of out in the country. Everybody lived in downtown Los Angeles, which, by the way, was heavily populated with oil wells. Bunker Hill, for example, and the area just to the west of the Harbor Freeway was heavily populated with oil wells. Even South Central had many oil wells, and there's still oil fields throughout the Los Angeles County area, including Signal Hill and the Long Beach area. Baldwin Hills was built in the 20s. There weren't very many houses. There was really almost none out there at the time. There was like rolling hills. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Los Angeles in the 1920s, but UCLA, for example, was built in the late 1920s, and it was surrounded by brown hills. It wasn't populated with people. So, in a way, the oil fields were there first, and then we built homes around them. I think if we were to do it today and say, can we put an oil field in the middle of a community where there are many people, I think it would probably be turned down as being too dangerous. But we're kind of stuck with a historical situation where there's lots of oil. Beverly Hills used to be a heavy oil field. It's now been reduced to 18 active oil wells that are on the Beverly Hills High School campus. I don't know if you've heard about that, but there was an epidemic of cancers at the Beverly Hills High School that I at least attributed to the oil wells being present. The whole of Los Angeles is suffering, I think, from heavy exposure to petroleum activities in the sense that there are oil fields all over the Los Angeles basin. If you go to Dahlgren, which I think was just mentioned by the other guest, you'll find that there are many oil wells throughout the Los Angeles County area, and many of them are disguised. They'll put up a building and they won't put the oil wells inside the building, and there's no signs on the building. You don't know what's going on there, but it's actually an active oil field. They do slant drilling. The Baldwin Hills area, for example, a lot of the fracked wells are actually under the populated sections of Culver City, Inglewood, the West Los Angeles area. They slant drill and remove hydrocarbons from miles away from the wellhead. And that's what's so disturbing, because you're disturbing the soil underneath people's homes, thus creating the possibility and the reality of contaminants coming up through the soil into the homes.
Oh my gosh, this is like bad news. If it's not one thing, it's another. It's all negative. You just, you get to the point where you just want to hibernate in your house. You know what I mean?
Well, you may want to go out into a pristine area where there's less oil wells, but nevertheless, you're right. You might want to try to put your head in the sand.
Yeah.
Hope everything goes away, but it won't.
Because I'm living right in the middle of it. You know what I mean? If it's not one thing, it's another. It's so negative. So now
go back to Berkeley.
Is it clean up there?
Cleaner than down here.
Is it really?
Yes.
Okay, so we've spoken with Dr. Williams, we've spoken with Dr. Dahlgren, and now we're going to bring on Paul Ferrazi, who's the executive director of the Citizens Coalition for a Safe Community. I'd like you both to stay on, because if we have time at the end, you guys can just interject with whatever you'd like to say. So, Paul, welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show. And Paul, let me tell you a little bit about Paul. Paul is an activist and a cinematographer. Did I get that right, Paul?
That's right. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi,
Thanks
Paul.
for on your show.
So tell us, what news do you have for us regarding fracking?
Well, as far as what's happening more or less in the Los Angeles basin, ever since the Air Quality Management District, or South Coast Air Quality Management District, invoked a regulatory rule, 1148.2, which required the oil operators and their contractors to report the chemicals that they were using, and even the ones that they considered proprietary. They're doing more acidizing, which is a chemical type of fracturing, which melts the calcium in the formation, so it breaks it up similarly to the water and sand and proppant that is used in traditional fracking. Most of the fracking that's been done in the Baldwin Hills, or the Inglewood oil field, as it's called, has been conventional or vertical fracturing. There were 21 wells that were done that way in a deep formation at 10,000 feet. In 2006, there were 2 cases of accidental releases, and these were in these 10,000-foot deep wells. That one of them had been fracked, and the other one looked like it was being prepared to be fracked. But mud blew back, and these oil field gases, which included hydrogen sulfide and the volatile organic compounds, along with methane, hung over an area in Culver City called the Culver Crest. This is an area that is mostly doctors, and it's, I guess you'd call it kind of the Beverly Hills of Culver City, if that's possible. And that led to the county having to come up with a solution, because right after the oil operators said it was, a lone incident, wouldn't happen again. This was in January of 2006, the first episode. It happened in February of 2006. So in stepped the county supervisors, and they came up with this plan, what's called a community standards district, but it's specific regulations that have been either existing or added in the way of additional mitigations that the oil operator had to do, to be able to operate again. But as we've gone along, as part of these conditions, we find that sort of the intention and of the language is interpreted as minimally as possible. So you think you're going to get a full report on any sort of complaints of odors and what the eventuality was, or what the if in fact the regulatory agency came in and issued any violations, but you only get sort of the anonymous notation that someone in this area has reported an odor. But so anyway, that's and what they're doing now as well, which is a type of fracturing, is called high rate gravel packing, and that's where they put what looks like or it's basically a filter to keep the sand out of the well around the casing. But they do that at lower pressures. But they're doing it in not just a single formation, because as you go down, there are different formations that are either producing or not producing oil. But they'll do it in one vertical well, in multiple zones. So again, as Thomas said, this is all weakening, the structures of the geology there. And what we've seen, or the Windsor Hills area specifically has seen, and this is really, we've tried to get politicians involved in this and actually address it. For some reason, they're scared of the oil and gas industry, or they're wanting those campaign contributions to flow in when they move to another office.
That's the issue, isn't it? Isn't the issue that the policies coming out of D.C. from both parties, Democrat and Republican, are wrong-headed across the board, with specifically?
Well, I would call them, I would call them cowardly. Some other people would call them pragmatic, but. I don't think there's any sort of will there to protect us the way that they're mandated to. I mean, and it's not just on the federal level; it's on the county and the state level as well. I mean, with what Jerry Brown did to the two people that were in, one was the director of the Department of Conservation, the other was the oil and gas supervisor, when they were trying to get heavily involved in addressing hydraulic fracturing because it was more or less under the radar. They started slowing permitting down, because that's one of the things that happens with this industry. It is carte blanche, basically. If they apply for a permit and isn't permitted within 10 days. It automatically defaults to a permit. So what happened was they were looking into that issue of the employee who was sucked into a sinkhole in an oil field that was using steam injection, and and trying to prevent it, and then also looking more closely at hydraulic fracturing. And they were eventually fired because the industry said that, we've always had this great relationship with the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, and this is slowing down, our production. And so here are the two people that are actually doing the job that they're supposed to, because they're mandated to protect public health and safety in Public Resources Code, and the governor gets rid of them and then installs two people, Mark Necadome as the Department of Conservation Director, and then Tim Kustick then as the Oil and Gas Supervisor. And if anyone wants to see a really good show to see exactly sort of the approach that the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources taken, you should check out a show that SoCal Connected did called The F Word on KCET. Still available online, as a video, like a YouTube video that you can stream. Mm-hmm. But it really gives you an idea of, the fact that they're not really looking. And here's one really, really important issue that hasn't been addressed: gas migration. And Tom was part of this investigation of this catastrophe. But on March 24th, 1985, there was what was called the Ross gas furnace explosion. And that was caused by a fault opening up underneath the Salt Lake oil field and allowing methane to escape. And then a woman in the Ross store punching her time card, and the spark from the time card ignited all the methane that had collected in the Ross stress furnace. So, it has been isotopically analyzed. That methane was isotopically analyzed. And again, when it happened in 1989, where it just came to the surface but didn't explode, and it was identified as the Salt Lake oil field, petrogenic or thermogenic gases in methane based on its composition. Okay. And Dogger contends that this was biogenic in origin. And what biogenic means is that it was swamp gas. And it couldn't possibly have been, because the fire burned for like 2.5, 3 days on the streets in the Fairfax district.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're
so
speaking with...
How can you put your trust in that kind of an agency that will not address the science? Because that's something that Mark Necadome said is he is going to use science. And I know that Tom is cringing right now because it isn't all that much science. It's a lot of technical stuff, as he says. But,
I talk about that a lot on this show, the Kathleen Wells Show, how our politicians have been bought. So they're not seeking the benefit, they're not seeking the best benefit for the people, or they're not seeking the truth, because many politicians deny climate change. So it's all about the lobby. It's all about special interests buying our politicians. We're speaking with Dr. Tom Williams and Dr. James Dahlgren and Paul Ferrazi about this bad news thing called fracking. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you, I just read an article about Germany, how they're just revolutionizing the whole industry, so to speak, for their country anyway. We'll be back.
This presentation is brought to you by theKathleenWellsShow.com.
Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. We've been talking about fracking with Dr. Tom Dahlgren, Dr. Tom Williams, Dr. James Dahlgren, and now we have Paul Ferrazi. Let me tell you, Paul, I just read an article. It says Germany sets new record generating 74% of power needs from renewable energy. So talk to me about these alternatives.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole, the whole focus of the People's Climate March in New York, is that we really have to cut and reduce the use of fossil fuels like tar sands and natural gas. And people are going to have to, tuck it in and take or ride bikes, use public transit, and attempt to build sustainable communities using renewables in the way of solar and wind, and of course improve overall efficiencies of anything that is electric. I mean, it seems like a Herculean task if you just look and stand on any overpass over any freeway in California as to how how we're going to be able to do this. But in that CO2 levels are at 392 parts per million right now, and the supposed maximum safe level was 350 parts per million, and the norm for the planet has generally been 270 parts per million. But we've had 300 years of burning coal and oil, and all of these things have to be improved. And I know that Tom has said that there's one way to do it is paint roofs white too, to reflect a lot of the heat that all of our asphalt-based roofs are absorbing, filling it, making it that much warmer, the planet that much warmer.
Okay, so we've got what 4 minutes. So, Dr. Williams, give me 1 minute? How would you like to go out? What would you like to say in 1 minute?
Open up all of the files, make them accessible through the internet, so that people can find out. And I always put it this way: in order to be on the same page, you got to have a page, and it has to be the same page that everybody else has. And if we could achieve that, I say things would greatly improve. We spent a lot of time with the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and they formulated the first air emissions monitoring system for fracking and other stimulation in the United States. And that became the core of the Senate Bill 4 by Fran Pavley, just basically to find out what's going on before it goes on. So I always go back to my informed consent and information accessibility.
Informed consent and information accessibility. Dr. Dahlgren, give us your 1 minute.
Well, what I would like to see happen is for people to be educated about the issues that we've been talking about. We need the mass media, the electronic media, the TV news programs to truly educate the public and get them aware of the fact that they're being exposed to these harmful chemicals, and a whole host of serious diseases are in an epidemic form. What most people are concerned about, I think, is the things like autism and hyperactivity disorder in children. This is very likely associated with our environment, and we need to begin to control the environment to prevent these terrible diseases.
We need to begin to control the environment to prevent these terrible diseases. In fact, Germany is doing energy transformation, which aims to power the entire country, almost entirely on renewable sources by 2050. 2050. Okay, Paul, give us your 1 minute.
I wonder if I could address the political aspect of it again, if that's okay, because I do want to give one politician credit, which isn't something that I normally would do, but in that the Inglewood oil field is the largest urban oil field in the United States. We were lucky to have Holly Mitchell in both the Assembly and Senate offer moratorium bills, and unfortunately both of them failed, but she was brave enough to take that and, take the fight for it and attempt to get, a majority of Democrats, unfortunately, that didn't vote for it. So we have to question if those Democrats are actually representing the people, in that I think it was something like at least 52% of Californians favored the idea of having a moratorium before drilling or all this hydraulic fracturing was allowed to go forward, both in
Okay, there's our music, Paul. Thank you very much. But thank you, Dr. Dahlgren, Dr. Williams. We're talking about fracking. It's a bad thing. We'll be back next week. Thanks.